For several decades now, domestic workers have had to bear the brunt of some really poor industry-related practices. Join us in this week's show as we take a look at legislation only recently impacting the way workers are receiving benefits and how to understand exactly what the recourse is. Is it fit for purpose? Workers' World starts now.
From England to Poland, every step across the ocean, the ruling classes, them is in a mess. Oh yes, the capitalist system a regress, but the Soviet system now progress. So
Welcome to our Workers' World show. I'm your host, Shiriq Trubadi. Thank you once again for having joined us, particularly as we try and close the gap for a segment of our workers that are finding it quite a challenge to seek recourse. We talk, of course, about domestic workers that have historically been at the heart of the reproductive labor required by society and particularly the economy. The vast majority of domestic workers are women, and their labor remains grossly undervalued. They have been part of struggles for several decades in South Africa to secure worker rights while being conditionally included in the LRA as well as the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. This while they have been excluded from the protection of the Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act, COIDA, for over 2 decades now. In today's show, we learn more about COIDA, the victory that domestic workers have now been able to attain since 2022, as well as to understand its impact. But first, let's now go to our insert prepared for us by the Workers' World Media Productions editorial team.
COIDA is supposed to cover all workers, but under this act, you cannot claim if you're a domestic worker in a private household, you see, and that is a major concern. Then as well, workers who are in the defense force, they are not covered by COIDA, and also workers in the police force, they are not covered. And then also workers who may be working abroad for a period of longer than 12 months, unless there is a specific agreement with the Compensation Commission.
I think it's great that workers want that, the domestic workers want that. The issue is going to be, the implementation. And there are several problems. The one thing is just how familiar workers are going to be with that right. We face that same problem with labour broker worker rights. There's a very low level of unionization of domestic workers. It's something like 0.5% of domestic workers are unionized. So that's going to be your first problem. How many workers are aware of this right that they have? A second problem certainly is going to be, that compensation fund is a nightmare. The thing is riddled with corruption, absolutely riddled. It has been for years. The state has taken absolutely no measures to fix the problems of the compensation fund.
This was the first long-term injury. From last year up till now, I'm still not able to perform my duties in the companies to pay only for the first 3 months. And then they stop paying you. Then you have to put in a claim by the WCEA. I cannot perform the same duties that I used to do. I can't say if I will ever be mentally ready to go back into this environment. I don't know whether I will be able to deal with it or not. After the injury, there's a huge financial burden. There's a guy who perhaps was the sole breadwinner that cannot work and provide anymore for his family. I mean, how does he feel as a man? An impact on the marriage. The marriage can break up as a result of this. I mean, children can go into drug addiction, trying to find a way to cope with what is happening in the family as a result of that injury.
It is more the case that there's a big delay between the submission of the completed forms and the actual benefit that the injured worker and his family or his family may get, you see. So I think these delays are difficult. Then also because of the centralization in the past, I think there's some decentralization now. Inquiries took a long time. It was very expensive for people to phone and find out. And literally, I know I could sometimes spend a day engaging with the Compensation Commissioner's office to find out about claims and so on.
You know, it brings so much joy because, more especially in the case of Maria Mahlangu, because I started with the case from the grassroots. To have domestic workers included in COIDA is an insurance that domestic workers never had before. It brings hope to the domestic workers who were also injured in the past on duty, as it applied retrospectively to 1994. But really, this is a victory that it's a landmark case and a victory that we will never forget in the history of domestic workers.
I don't think that's going to happen. You know, the employer must go and register these workers, then pay the compensation levy. I don't think that's going to happen. And the department doesn't really have any enforcement mechanism, as we've seen with the national minimum wage and all kinds of other issues facing workers. There's going to be no inspectorate that goes out, and you know, the inspectors also are not allowed to enter private houses. That's the one thing that the BCEA excludes. So how is this going to be enforced? You know, so it's difficult to see how this will actually then convert into anything concrete for these workers, unless there's a major organizing drive amongst those workers. And that's always been one sector that is really very, very difficult to organize.
So for us, it is a breakthrough for domestic workers. And like the domestic workers that were saying at the ILO, today we've got back our freedom and our dignity. Don't let us lose it again.
All right, so as we've seen, there are a number of challenges still with implementing and understanding the impact of COIDA. Once we do return from the break, we get into it and understand it a little bit better. Do stay with us. All right, welcome back, and thanks very much for joining us. We are talking about COIDA, a particular piece of legislation that could potentially have severe impact in the type of recourse that domestic workers do have. As we heard there from our insight a bit earlier, that it's still a significant challenge with domestic workers in particular struggling to attain the sort of rights that are enshrined in legislation. I have a panel of guests with us in studio for this conversation, as well as online. We have Gloria Kente, the South African Domestic Service and Allied Workers Union, with us. Also Feiruz Mulaji, the coordinator at Centro, while also joining us online is Maggie Ntombeni, a case manager at the Izwe Domestic Workers Alliance. Thanks very much to you for having joined us. I want to start off with you, Gloria. Maybe to start off with giving us some sort of an insight about the working conditions of domestic workers.
The domestic workers are working under the conditions of not recognized at their workplace as workers. And also, the domestic workers don't get contracts from their employers, and they don't benefit from the labor rights, because the employer is claiming that this is my house. You will do what you have to do. And the domestic workers, they are working long hours. They don't have time for themselves. And domestic workers are facing the challenges of harassment at the workplace, sexual harassment, and also they are abused by the employers. And domestic workers are working with strong chemicals where they construct the disease. Domestic workers, when they have to get their salaries, they have to fight for even their salaries from the employers. That's the conditions that the domestic workers are facing at their workplace. There's no respect. They don't get respect from their employers.
Okay, and so there's been some ground covered in terms of the legislation that is seeking to provide cover for that, and I want to get into exactly what that happens to be. But let's bring Feiruz into the conversation at the moment. Feiruz, has this segment of workers received the necessary attention when it comes to the protection of not just their dignity, but also the conditions under which they work?
Look, I think, I just sort of, if I look at it chronologically, in 1997, the BCEA was promulgated and domestic work portion under the BCEA. In 2002, it was sectoral determination 7, which was an extension of the BCEA. So all the coverage of the BCEA, but the gaps, it didn't go far enough given the nature of domestic work. So we had the Minister of Labour introduce SD7. So by and large, that was 2002. In 2011, domestic workers fell under the protection of Convention 189, the ILO Convention 189. So yes, coverage, legal coverage is very, very good. Domestic work a right to collectively bargain, but who do they bargain with? Because there are no employer bodies, for example. So legal coverage for domestic workers in this country is excellent. But when it comes to the implementation of those rights, I think that's where we fall terribly short in terms of ensuring that domestic workers do enjoy the full protection of the law.
Yeah, and before I get into exactly what COIDA is and how it responds to some of the challenges in the workplace, let's bring Maggie into the conversation from the Israel Domestic Workers Alliance at the moment, and try and understand that since 2002, which is what now 24 years since the inaction, for instance, of different parts of legislation. Has there been any movement, at least in the last 2 years, in regards to how legislation is closing the gap and responding to some of the conditions that Gloria had outlined for us?
Responding to that, I don't think there is any change which we see as domestic workers, because the reason why we feel like Department of Labour is not doing any enforcement to enforce employers to register their domestic workers, because right now we are still trying to collect all those cases which they happened before. But still, with the new cases which are still happening, there is no any help which we are finding from Department of Labour, because, like example, right now, still domestic workers, they are still getting hurt at work. They are still contacting to their diseases, but still the employers are still taking them to their family doctors, and then they can't even get the doctors what they need to the Department of Labour so that they can claim the COIDA. So we are still struggling as domestic workers, because employers they're still like feeling like they're doing us a favor, because there is no any enforcement from Department of Labour.
Okay, and that's, I think, an important point. Enforcement is lacking, but what would enforcement look like, Gloria? Is it inspectors that would have to determine what exactly?
Because this legislation is still new, so we want the Department of Labour to work together with us as unions and also the federation to educate the workers and also the employers. When we are touching on the case of the inspectors, the labor will say to us as union, we are short of inspectors in your sector. So, but we are telling the Department of Labor that they must try to employ more inspectors so they can go and inspect the houses where the workers are working. They said it's a shortage of inspectors.
Okay, and I think that has been a historic issue that defines bureaucracy in government that I want to come to a bit later in the program. But maybe, Gloria, before I go to a break, I just want to understand COIDA. What in essence is it? And when we return from the break, we'll get deeper into it. But before we go for that break, what is COIDA?
COIDA is a compensation for occupational injuries and disease. It's a fund where the domestic workers, when they get ill or they are injured or they died in their workplace, that they can claim from it. That is the COIDA. So now the domestic workers are included. They can claim to that fund.
Okay, and are there conditions that determine what qualifies them to claim from the fund?
The employer must, if the worker gets injured at the workplace, the employer is the one who must fill in the form submitted to the Department of Labor.
Okay, and there already are some challenges, because what happens in scenarios when an employer doesn't even want to recognize the rights of the employee, and then we have stumbling blocks around applying to COIDA and so on. And so these are some of the complexities that we hope to get into as we make our way through our program here today. Thanks very much for our guests. So we'll go for a break and we return to understand a little bit more about COIDA and its impact. Right, we are talking about a vulnerable sector of workers, domestic workers in particular, and the level of recourse through legislation that is accorded to them only just in the recent years, but there are evidently some challenges in the understanding and implementation of COIDA, a fund set up to assist with occupational injuries and even when there happens to be death while working. And so these are the bits of legislation that we're trying to understand and how better to implement it for a segment of workers that are as vulnerable as domestic workers are. Let's bring Fairuz into the conversation at this time to look at how progressive COIDA is at the moment in being able to respond to some of the working conditions that we've highlighted in our previous discussion.
Yeah, you see, as with all the other laws, I mean, it's taken about, as far as I can remember, almost 20 years to lobby for inclusion of domestic workers under COIDA. So, and it's been quite a struggle, to have domestic workers who were deliberately excluded now included under the protection of COIDA. Now, if you can remember, it was around 2002 when domestic workers were also included through sectoral determination, and the BCEA were included for unemployment insurance benefits. And up till today, the majority of domestic workers are not registered for UIF. COIDA, which was promulgated in 2022, has a long way to go, because at this stage, and I had a chat with Gloria earlier in the week, just to confirm again what have been the kind of cases that have come to the union, seeking compensation for injuries at work. Have there been COIDA cases that have come to the union in the last while? And in the Western Cape office of SADSAU, there have been none. And what would be the reason for that? So yes, Legally, domestic workers are covered, they can claim for, but at this stage, I'm not sure whether there has been sufficient organization among the workers, and I think Gloria mentioned it earlier. Has there been enough education, awareness raising of the benefit? And I think that is one of the big problems at this point, that workers are not really clear about where to go, what to do, and how to engage with the system in order to access the benefits of COIDA. There isn't a list, for example. So by and large, there is work to be done among the domestic workers themselves and their support organizations to strategize carefully and clearly about how to ensure that domestic workers do access the benefit. We cannot rely on government. We have these imbizos once a year maybe, where workers are brought together, but in between those big events, there is no real organization and education to ensure that workers know what and where to apply for these benefits.
Yeah. Okay, I want to maybe just, Maggie, understand, and I mean, that is quite startling, and Gloria can maybe give us a little bit more detail a bit later about why there hasn't been, in the 2 years, any sort of cases where workers may have exploited the benefits of COIDA, to their benefit. How many instances, or how frequent or regular, Maggie, would you say, there are cases, incidents at work, during the duties of being at work, would a domestic worker necessarily either get injured, contract a disease, suffer death while being at work, etc.? How regular are these cases, in the dispensing of domestic work that you think can indeed be covered by COIDA?
Thank you. Yes, and then responding on that, the problem is the medical report. As domestic workers, we don't know which clinic or hospital or doctors to go so that we can have that proper medical report, which is going to say, I contracted this disease at work, or because the only thing which is clear is the bite dog bites. The dog bites are clear, and then sometimes it's also not clear, also coming from the Department of Labor, because if they say the employer's dog, if the employer's dog bites you while you are on lunch time, they are not going to cover that. It's still not clear with us also to educate some domestic workers about this COIDA thing, because we don't even educated enough also about COIDA. We know what is COIDA exactly, but we don't know even how they calculate the money. We don't even know which kind of case we can take to Department of Labor exactly, and then what kind of medical report, which hospital to go, which doctors to use. And then also, I think the other thing, the employers must be told that they are not supposed to take us as domestic workers to their family doctors. I'm repeating this again. So we are, it's not clear with us still. I think if we can just find some organization which are going to educate us more about this issue, we can even have some more cases to take to Department of Labor.
Yeah. Gloria, what are the typical occupational injuries that come with being a domestic worker?
When you are working at your workplace, you are working with ladders, cleaning the windows, and also some of the employers, they have the swimming pools at their workplace that are not fenced, they are not covered. And also we are working with there's a wires in the employer's house where there's wires are not covered, the electricity wires. So we get injured when we are working with those things that are not covered. So that is why the domestic workers they need to be covered by this COIDA.
And in order for a domestic worker to be covered by COIDA, as you said earlier, it depends on the employer making the application. But does the employee have to show that she is an employee, that this is her work, that she does domestic work, and that she has a contract, that she has, any sort of discernible evidence that she is in the employ of the employer, and that he or she has the right to go and apply on the employee's behalf?
The employer must have all the details of the employee in the first place. So when the employer is applying for the domestic workers, she must make sure that she have all the document of the domestic worker to apply for the domestic worker.
Okay, and how routine is that? Because earlier you said there's not even a contract really that exists. So I'm just curious to understand, is the conversation then, the education at least around COIDA, should it be with domestic workers or should it be with employers rather than the domestic workers?
The education is supposed to be both parties, for the domestic worker and the employers. That is what we are always asking the Department of Labor, because when we have meetings with the employers and talk to the employers will say, we don't know about the COIDA. What is COIDA? So we pledge the Department of Labor to have those meetings, those workshops with the employees and the employers.
And should we differentiate between the formal sector that may employ domestic workers on a larger scale for domestic work versus the household, for instance, that employs a domestic worker? Are the two different, or are we reaching out to both of those?
We are reaching both of those employments.
Yeah.
Those employers, because it's a domestic worker, they are falling under the domestic sector, even if they are working in the big companies. Yeah. They are registered there as a domestic worker. So the Department of Labor must educate the big companies that are employed the domestic workers and also the private houses employers.
All right, so the reason why I'm asking those questions is because how do we get COIDA implemented and understood? We are the streams that we need to approach in order to get it fully realized. We'll get into more of that once we return from the break. And particularly, I'm interested to hear about Mapi Mshlangu. Who is she and why is she important to this discussion? That and more after the break. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying with us. We are talking about domestic workers and in particular, recent advances made to try and cover any injuries, diseases or any calamities that may befall domestic workers while they're at work. It's seen as a massive progressive step forward. But in so doing, there are challenges in understanding the legislation, implementing the legislation, and of course making, as we've discussed in our previous segment, both the employee and the employer aware of the fact that COIDA exists and that domestic workers are covered by it. But evidently there are challenges, which Maggie, I want to pick up with you on this, because Gloria had highlighted also previously, the conundrum in understanding who is the responsible party here. Is it the domestic worker that seemingly doesn't know that they are covered by COIDA? Is it the employer? But how complicated is that when the employer doesn't even have a contract, for instance, with their employee, i.e. domestic worker? Well, what's your sense about how to remedy that?
Oh, thank you so much. So I think we also supposed to engage the employers' organization on this, because are the ones who are educating their client who are domestic workers employers. Because like COIDA is differ on UIF, because example on UIF, the employer and the employee, they are both paying 1%, and then on COIDA it's only the employer who's paying, and then it's also on the employer who's supposed to claim that money from the Department of Labor. So it's more difficult for domestic workers to know if they are registered or not. At the same time, they are not supposed to claim it also. So the Department of Labor and the employers organization, they also supposed to educate employers about this, because it seems like they don't even know. Most of them, they don't know that domestic workers, they are also now included to COIDA, because Sometimes if you talk about it with the employers, they say the system, the Department of Labor system is not clear to them, also employers. There's some other good employers who are really want to register their domestic workers, but they are struggling because of the Department of Labor's website. I think they're supposed to make it clear and then understand them also for us domestic workers, so that we can also go there to the system, to their website and read. Even though we know that we are not able to register ourselves, but our employers must do that also, to read and understand what are the qualifications they're supposed to be there. Thank you.
Yeah. But Feiruz, I want to try and understand here. Look, you have a high degree of informality that almost describes this industry. Yes, you have certain agencies that have workers that conduct domestic work, and we hope in those instances the business, it's formalized, they have employees on the book, and they're meant to be granting the necessary legislative legal cover to their workers as is required by law. But there's a high degree of this particular segment of workers that are in the almost informal structures of employment. They are dependent on whether a household can afford to have a domestic worker. And then when the household has a domestic worker, they are treated very poorly. Sometimes they get a place to sleep. Sometimes they get food, while they're working. They don't have the necessary tools, etc. And then also the work is not necessarily seasonal, but it can sometimes be on and off. And that's a large chunk of domestic workers that work in and almost a sense of informality. And so I want to maybe piece out with you whether there is an opportunity here to formalize it in a better way that places a greater burden of responsibility on the employer.
Look, I think what you're touching on is the complexity of the sector. It almost doesn't really matter whether it is formal or informal, because domestic workers are legally covered. And so employers and workers need to be educated about their rights. Awareness needs to be raised. Um, Employers need to take responsibility. Now, just sort of coming back to COIDA and, the operations of COIDA, in order for domestic worker to, and I think Maggie has also kind of covered some of that, in order for the worker to benefit from the compensation fund, you have to be registered. And workers can't register themselves. It's your employer who has to register you. When it comes to claiming the benefit, the employer also has to complete all the formal documents that need to be submitted to the commissioner. But the worker also can take up the matter, and you can go to your own doctor or clinic and get an independent medical report and complete all of those documents. And if you are registered under the compensation fund, if your employer has registered you, you can process all of those documents. But how do workers even know, as Maggie says, whether they are registered or not? Like with UIF, and I come back to that continuously because we've had the same issues with UIF and compliance. So, many employers of domestic workers, you made reference to the kind of informal relations. And it's understandable because many domestic employers have not really cottoned onto the idea that they're actually an employer. So that is what renders the relationship kind of informal. And that is why the unions are so important, to enable those workers to understand their rights in that relationship with the employer. So, as we have done consistently to check with workers, are you registered for UI? And so the same has to happen now for COIDA, because it's amazing that that workers have won the struggle for inclusion and for the provisions of the legislation that's a great achievement. But the work starts now, because how do you enable workers? We don't have, for the domestic sector, there isn't a collective bargaining framework, for example. There are no, so there isn't a system that you can kind of connect with, that you can engage with, to ensure that there are certain compliance measures in place. So the work really starts now. It's one thing to kind of, having lobbied all the years for the benefit, but now how do we structure that? How do we structure that? And I've just compiled a list of, what the typical injuries and occupational injuries are in the sector. And I will share that with Gloria and Maggie after this meeting, but after this session. But that's the sort of thing that needs to happen going forward.
Feroz,
No?
what are they? I'm curious to know as well. Can you let our viewers in, just a handful of them, what are those typical
Yeah.
injuries?
Look, I mean, a lot of it is physical and related to the specific occupation, in terms of cleaning, in terms of care work in domestic situations. So workers ordinarily would develop muscle, bone, and joint injuries related to their tasks. They will slip, trip, and fall. They will cut themselves. They are bruised. They are burnt. They develop respiratory issues, given the materials they work with, chemical exposure, the cleaning agents. I think Gloria already mentioned that. Repetitive strain injuries, you kind of do the same
Yeah, and I think that
physical.
those, I just want to pick up on one, one or two of those. Gloria, cutting off my finger, and there's, some little issues there. It's almost, par for the work, the conditions that confront domestic workers. How are we going to get employers to realize that that is something worthy of seeking recourse for the worker? Because you may sit with a scenario that there are blockages in the attitudes of the employer to not recognize that that is an injury worth applying to COIDA for.
That is why we are saying the employers need the education to know that when the worker cut or the worker injured at a workplace must get compensation. The education is the best. That is the only thing that we must do for the employers.
Yeah.
Yes, so the domestic workers can get compensation.
All right, and I think that the important bit from this entire conversation thus far is that education is key, not just for employee, but employer as well. Once we return from the break, how to close the gap and make this victory that workers have attained one that they will fully realize in a material way that will benefit their lives. That and more after the break. Do stay with us.
We are an online news website that brings you news, analysis, and perspectives from working class, marginalized communities and labor.
Le mali esikhiphayo ku-government kungcono kakhulu than ukuhlukunyezwa lokhu esikuhlukunyezwa ngamapolisa.
Elicha is published by Workers World Media Productions and is a bilingual website as we cover labor, health, education, and local government issues in English and isiXhosa.
Le corona asiya noba xa sifika emzini siyayizisa okanye mhlawumbi siyayithatha.
To get community, national, and international news from Elicha, please subscribe to our website and download our mobile app.
All right, we are in the last stretch of our show. The Workers will show, Labour show, unpacking, of course, a whole host of challenges in realizing COIDA, a fund essentially set up for workers that are injured at work. Sometimes they suffer disease while being at work, including potentially suffering death from an injury. These are all covered. Domestic workers are now, in the recent years, they've been included as legal cover for a benefit from the fund, but there are bureaucratic, administrative challenges as well as educational challenges in order to get them to benefit from the fund, as it were. The name I mentioned a bit earlier, Mapi Mhlangu, who was she? What was her case? And how did her experience, as unfortunate as it was, bring us to where we are today?
Mama Mahlangu was a domestic worker in Pretoria. She was working for this family, and she was cleaning the windows, and she used a step ladder. And then because of her eyesight, because she couldn't see properly, and then she slept on the ladder and fell on the pool that was not covered. There was no fence. And then later on, the employer find her lying on that pool, and she was dead already. It was 2012. So the daughter of Mama Mahlangu went to the Department of Labor. She wants the Department of Labor to compensate Mama Mahlangu and also them as a family. But the Department of Labor couldn't do that. They said there's no compensation for that case. And she's seeking help, and then the case of her came to SATSAU. SATSAU is the South African Domestic Service and Allied Workers Union. And then SATSAU supported her and then organized lawyers to take this case further. And the case was in Pretoria in the High Court. Mm-hmm. That is where the judge ruled that this was unconstitutional of the domestic workers not included in the COIDA.
Yeah.
Yes.
And of course, that is a very sensitive case that I'm certain could disturb some of you that are viewing this discussion. But certainly, Maggie, it's all too real an experience of very many domestic workers. This was an absolute tragedy in the case of Mapi Mhlangu, and it's a travesty that it had to take this experience for domestic workers to be included as part of benefits such as COIDA. How many more Mapi Mhlangus are there whose stories we're not documenting, Maggie?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get the question clear.
How many more, Mhlangus are there whose stories like this are crucial to understanding why they should benefit from COIDA that perhaps are not being documented or even being spoken about?
I think there are a lot of cases like Maria Mahlangu. And then the thing is just because some of domestic workers, they don't even know their employers' names right now. And then some employers, they've moved from where they've been located before. They relocated. And then it's difficult as a domestic worker to claim COIDA if you don't have evidence that your case was related to work. So there's lots of cases like that. And then the other thing, when I turn to the migrant workers, it's also supposed to be clear on the migrant workers, because sometimes we are being told that they're supposed to have some document to claim COIDA. Sometimes we are being told that they're supposed to have some identification to claim COIDA, which is still not clear. And then most of the times, domestic workers who are facing difficulties like this on COIDA, they are migrants, because some local domestic workers, it's much easier for them because they know where to go, they know which doors to knock, and then they do knock and find help. So some migrant domestic workers, they don't even know where to go. So I think there's lots of cases like this, but they are not filed just because one, domestic workers, there's some domestic workers who still don't know about COIDA. At the same time, there's some employers who still don't know about COIDA. At the same time, again, there's some domestic workers which they have those cases like this, but now they don't have any evidence or anything related to their employer so that they can claim COIDA.
Yeah, and I think that's the purpose of this particular program as well, is to bring that level of education to those domestic workers that may be viewing it, but more so to the employers, to make them realize that you have an obligation, to register your employee, and then also to make sure that your employee can benefit from any particular injury or disease they may contract while, of course, doing their job. I want to quickly come back to you, Gloria, and ask whether there are foreign nationals, migrants, that are covered in this particular dispensation, because I understand there's also a high proportionate of households that you make use of fellow Africans, Malawians, Somalis, etc., that work, in the field of domestic work. Are they covered?
The migrant workers, they are covered with this law, but as Maggie mentioned now, we have a problem of identification, like they don't have IDs, they're using their passport, some of them, their passport are expired, their working permits. So, but the Department of Labor, when we raise those questions, because we do have members in South that are migrant workers, they said they are busy with that now in the Home Affairs, that there's numbers that they must add from their numbers that they have, because they don't have those 13 digits that we have here in South Africa.
Yeah.
So the process is like that. They are busy with it, but it doesn't mean that if the migrant workers get injured at the workplace or something happened to the migrant worker, mustn't go and claim.
They should go and claim.
They must go to claim. Yes.
Okay, and again, obligation of the employer in this regard. Feiruz, how do we make this work? We've fought the big fight to get domestic workers to be covered. That is one partial part of the victory. How do we materially realize the impact that COIDA could have on the lives of domestic workers?
Yeah, from where I'm sitting, it's really about organize, organize, organize. There is no shortcut because these benefits were hard won and fought for. It didn't come easy. COIDA took decades to be promulgated. And I just want to go back to the Mahlangu case again. It took 8 years for the North Gauteng High Court to rule that exclusion, deliberate exclusion of domestic workers from COIDA is unconstitutional. And it took that because, as I said earlier, there's no collective bargaining framework for this sector. So domestic workers had to bargain with the state in the court in order to move the process forward. And it took a tragic incident like the drowning of Mama Mahlangu to move the process forward. The legal process goes through such a long and tedious winding road. And with strong organization, those processes can be sped up. So we spoke earlier about inspectors also, and this has been an ongoing conversation because inspectors equal compliance, but there will never be enough inspectors. And I think, we need to accept that reality that there will not be. I mean, if you take the close to 1 million households that are being serviced by domestic workers, there is no way you can have the kind of regular inspections that you have in offices, factories, and so forth. You cannot expect that same method of inspections for compliance. Mm-hmm. And so there also, over the years, there was talk of self-monitoring, where workers rely on their own resources to call out non-compliance issues. And then you can go to an inspector and say, in this location, in this geographic location, there is widespread non-compliance. So you can then target those areas. So these are the kinds of discussions that I think need to happen.
And I'm hoping, truly hoping that our program moves the needle in what we ought to attain for the benefit of domestic workers. Thank you very much once again for having tuned in. We'll do this again next week. It's been an absolute pleasure hosting you once again. Thank you and bye-bye.